Hi, guys. I'm Jen. I'm co-founder of Topology, and I want to start this talk with a nod to one of the most dedicated innovators in all of history, Wile E. Coyote. Every quarter, this guy's got an updated plan. He's got a detailed service blueprint. He's got the latest AI technology. And every quarter, he ends up hoisted by his own petard. I'm sure this feels a little familiar to at least some of you. He is a master of iteration. That's true. New ideas, new gadgets. But he's never really getting closer to his true goal. And that's because the tragedy of Wile E. Coyote is not that he fails, it's that he fails to learn. And if you think about it, a lot of our organizations behave in exactly the same way. Now, if you're a fan of Donald Schoen or Gregory Bateson, you could say our friend here is trapped in single loop or first level learning. He's trying harder, but he's not smarter. He upgrades his Acme devices, but not his own reasoning. And iteration without reflection isn't learning. And simply launching more catapults more quickly isn't a meaningful way to think about performance. Meaningful performance is about how effectively we can translate our experiences into new understanding and how fast we can turn that understanding into wiser action. And that's really what this talks about. Shifting our measures of success from are we checking the boxes to are we becoming more capable, more responsive, and better prepared for whatever comes next? Of course, you can't blame Wile E. Coyote. He's just doing what most of us are trained to do, right? Plan better, try harder, iterate faster. The problem is, in complex environments, like most of us are designing for, those instincts can actually betray us. Our plans, our blueprints, are merely hypotheses. They're not guarantees. And really, I think that's a pretty universal human experience that we all have in some form or another. We often have to learn it the hard way. In fact, this quote is usually attributed to this guy. He was a Prussian war official. And to be fair, I do not love a war metaphor here. Business has far too many of those, but that's not totally the point here. The point is to notice how long ago this quote is attributed, 1871. Turns out complexity and uncertainty and unpredictability aren't new. They're not uniquely modern aspects of a post-COVID VUCA world. It's simply part of life. And it has been for a really long time. And if we're being honest here, we've all been Wile E. Coyote at some point, convinced that if people would just listen to the research or see what our maps are telling them, that everything would work out. But if you think about it, we all really know there's more to being a service designer than just being the genius with a plan. So let's talk for just a moment about why even the best intentioned plans can send us running off the cliff, and what it actually would mean to think differently about how we design, learn, and perform in these systems. So the types of systems that we're most often concerned with as designers are human systems, and they're dynamic systems. And even more, they're usually complex, adaptive dynamic systems. And when the components of a system have autonomy and agency and are interconnected and interdependent, things get very unpredictable very quickly. Think about the healthcare ecosystem. Think about consumer behavior. Think about the intersections between economics and emotion. Hell, think about how hard physics would be if particles could think. That's actually really the fastest way to explain the entire field of complexity science straight from one of its founders. And when we talk about complexity or complexity science, I do like to take a moment to contrast what the word complex means compared to some of the other types of systems that are out there. I like a framework called the Cynefin framework for this purpose, which I'm not going to get into the details about, but it is a nice way just to highlight the aspects of complexity that are most relevant for service designers. So what we've got in this framework are predictable systems on the right and less ordered or not really predictable systems on the left. And the simplest on the bottom right are clear systems, which are really easy to understand. They're easy to figure out what's going on to, get in and determine what you want to do about it. This is literally like baking a cake, following a recipe. It's straightforward, it's predictable, and as long as you're following the directions and using the right ingredients, you're going to get the same result every time. This is the world of best practices. And we do love these scenarios. I know there are some of you who've gone into design, studying heuristics, interaction patterns, and maybe expecting design to be like this. But Lord knows it's really not actually all that common in our work. At the other extreme, which is also not all that common, is the chaotic domain. And if you're a science nerd, this is not actually using the word chaos in the way that mathematicians do, but it's just to say that there are situations where we've lost any kind of meaningful constraints and things are quite volatile. It's a crisis. Something's on fire, literally or figuratively. And all we can really do here is quickly apply novel practices until something sticks and we can get some structure in place. In the work of service design, I think both the highly predictable, clear situations and the volatile, chaotic ones are not really often the focus of our day-to-day work. They come up once in a while, but really, I think it's these other two that we're a lot more concerned with. So here we have another kind of predictable system. It's ordered. We can see the cause and effect. It just has a little more going on. It's a little complicated. So that's the term we use. You still have that predictable cause and effect behavior, but it does take a little bit more expertise to see it. You might need the analysis of or the lived experience of several different types of experts who can actually identify those cause and effect relationships for you. This is a little bit more like designing and launching a rocket into space. It's obviously harder and more complicated than baking a cake, but the laws of physics aren't changing every day, so doing this with the right experts in the room is relatively straightforward. In these realms, we don't always have best practice because different forms of analysis might yield different approaches and they can each be effective. But what we do rely on are what we call good enough practices. And finally, here at the top left is where we're really most interested today. In the complex domain, we get into systems that are not total chaos, but they're not inherently predictable either. That linear cause and effect, if A, then B, those relationships really aren't going to be observed in these kinds of domains. It's impossible to identify a single root cause for something or to describe these domains with conventional logic models and theories of change. Unless you're forcing a retroactive story onto the past, which does actually sometimes have use, it's that just these systems are not deterministic. So they're not breaking the rules of physics, but all the interdependencies make it so that we can't know for sure what is going to happen. And complex systems require us to engage in what are called exaptive practices. They let patterns emerge through action and reaction and reflection, because here, best practice is past practice. Maybe it worked yesterday, maybe it worked in a different context, but there's no guarantee it's going to work for you now, here, today, because complex systems change and continue to change in nonlinear ways. So this is best compared to navigating any kind of living relationships, right? If you've raised children or you take care of pets, or if you have to drive in traffic with other people, navigating those family and friendship dynamics, right? Anytime we joke that there's no instruction manual for something, it's a good signal that we're engaging with a complex system. So, given all of that, our primary goal here today is just to be able to differentiate these terms, mainly so we can avoid mistaking a complex system for a merely complicated one, because really, so much of our work is in complex domains. And even if you're thinking right now, well, my work is more similar to designing rockets than childcare or pet parenting, I guarantee you the human dynamics that surround your service design work would say otherwise. And unfortunately, complex systems are where traditional performance measures can fail us. Traditional things like KPIs and OKRs, scorecards, SMART goals, these are not inherently bad, but they've been developed for predictability, not complexity. And in complex domains, these targets can actually lead to perverse incentives. That's where people learn to meet these targets in ways that actually run counter to the spirit of what you're trying to measure in the first place. They can also drive short-term thinking and discourage experimentation, and they can blind us to the signals we actually need to be paying attention to. So what's the alternative, right? Well, I would say that in complex systems, progress and performance look a lot less like hitting targets and a lot more like learning our way forward. Okay, there's that word, learning. I'm not going to let us get away with talking about learning without unpacking it a little first, right? So what do we mean by the word learning? Well, I asked ChatGPT. Here's the response we get from there, and have a look at that. And then I asked ChatGPT about what assumptions went into that image, and it's interesting to take note of a few things, like learning being associated with school and cognitive labor, being a fairly individual act. Yet even Chat knew that there's more to the story here, that, learning in complex, dynamic, collaborative environments might mean some other things. So I won't assume that you would make these same assumptions, but I will ask, what do you think of when you think of learning? How about some non-AI generated, but still very typical definitions of learning? Maybe these are more familiar. What do these have in common? Usually, some notion of acquiring something. I've never liked this definition either, though. It's so limiting. A linear transaction that takes you from not having to having. That's it. That's all learning is. Yes, learning can be those things, but it's not just those things. So, for example, I want to think about some other ways that we might define learning, and these come from some folks who've done some very deep and meaningful thinking on the subject. For example, John Dewey might say that learning is making meaning from experience. And Etienne Wenger might say that it's a change in the capacity for action. Gregory Bateson might say that when a system becomes different from itself, it's learning. And his daughter Nora Bateson might say that it's mutual transformation across contexts. Deleuze would say that learning is being transformed by encounters with difference. And Freire might say that it's collaboratively reading the world to remake it. While Karen Barad might say that learning is participating in the world's entangled becoming. What all of these have in common is that they frame learning as a shift in understanding that actually changes what we do next. In other words, adaptation. Okay, great, Jen. That's very poetic, but where does service design come in here, right? Well, one important aspect of our work is that we facilitate and mediate the various potentials that are supported across a service ecosystem. I say potential for a reason, because that brings us to another really important concept called adaptive capacity. It's the ability of people or teams or whole systems to sense what's changing, to learn from it, and then act effectively through uncertainty. And this is where service design really does have such a crucial role to play. When it's practiced as a systems discipline, not just about blueprinting or orchestrating linear sequences of human behavior, but really thinking about the service ecosystems at play, it's really well equipped to help make complexity more legible and to help people orient within it so we can create conditions for meaningful action. Now, we do need to remember something. Change fatigue is very real. And for a lot of teams, the prospect of learning can feel overwhelming when it's going to look like another demand that's piled on top of everything else, or when it's the latest tool you're told to adopt, or the next quarterly pivot or new mandate you have to absorb. And when that's the case, learning and adapting quickly becomes something people brace for, or even unconsciously guard against, rather than something that they embrace. But the kind of learning we're talking about here, the kind of learning that actually builds adaptive capacity, it feels different. It's not about scrambling to catch up or dodge that oncoming train. It's actually really not about predicting the future at all. It's really a lot more about just getting better at not needing to. Because when you're able to sense and respond and move with some agility, when learning's woven into the rhythm of everyday work and it's, fit for purpose and context, it's not a drain. It's actually a source of momentum. And another cool thing about learning is that when you look closely enough, you start to notice a pattern. In science terms, we could say that learning is fractal, meaning it's self-similar at different scales. But in everyday human terms, you could say that adaptive capacity is something you see on the individual level, as well as the team and organization or even society level. You basically have something like an encounter where something unexpected happens, or, a disruption. Maybe it's a confusing signal or a spark of curiosity, a challenge that maybe doesn't fit something we already thought we knew. Then you might have something like a reframing that happens. We make sense of it. We might question assumptions or shift how we view, take on new perspectives. We might see a situation a little differently. And there's some kind of integration where something changes how we act, how we organize, how we decide based on what we've encountered and how it's been reframed. And whether we're talking about a single person or a small team or a whole organization, the scale changes, but the pattern repeats. It's how systems learn and evolve, whether the system is a huge company or one person. And it's what we can see in three brief examples that I'm about to share. Each of them at a different scale, but all of them are showing how service design can help organizations build their adaptive capacity, not just to cope with complexity, but learn through it. So let's start at the scale of a small team inside a well-regarded higher ed institution. They run a globally recognized online learning program. But like many folks in higher ed these days, they are up against a ton of disruption right now. Learning expectations are shifting faster than ever. AI is changing student behavior and needs. And the legacy platforms that they rely on simply aren't evolving fast enough to keep up. Now, the instinct in a situation like this might be to do some kind of strategic planning, pull up together, envision the future, work backwards from there to draft a sort of multi-year roadmap. But in an environment like this, where the foundations are moving under everyone's feet and we know they're going to keep changing, those plans are going to be obsolete before the ink is dry. So instead of mapping a service ecosystem here as a form of future planning, we approach it as a form of sense making. In other words, we use it to uncover what's already working about the present and what small moves might open up new possibilities. We collected narrative data, anecdotes about the current state from team and student perspectives, moments of success, frustration, pride, concern, and we mapped the broader learning ecosystem, not just the services and touch points that these guys controlled, but also the constraints, the relationships, the dependencies shaping their choices and their sphere of influence. And rather than designing for a distant future state, no matter how ideal, we married that narrative data and the landscape view here to discuss what could be done right now, right? Given current conditions that would not only nudge towards some more desirable outcomes, but teach them more about where they can keep going in the future. So the result here was not a sweeping 5-year plan. It was simply a portfolio of small, feasible moves, actions they could take immediately, test, learn, etc., gain some traction. It generated momentum where there had been an inertia kind of growing. And things like stabilizing good practices that were at risk or testing new learner engagement strategies, tracking some evolving norms around AI-driven academic integrity. These are not huge sweeping changes or grand gestures. More importantly, the team began thinking about strategy less as a fixed plan and more as an ongoing learning process. And they left with a clear sense of what to monitor, what to try out, how to adjust as conditions change. These are small but, meaningful signals of their growing adaptive capacity. Now let's zoom out a little bit to a slightly bigger scale. A large healthcare organization navigating new regulatory pressures around health equity. When CMS introduced its Health Equity Index, this organization realized that they needed a little bit of a deeper understanding of the social risk factors that impact their most vulnerable members. So these are folks navigating poverty, disability, and dual eligibility for Medicare and Medicaid. But this team's goal was not just to know more about these folks so they could sell to them. They needed to connect those insights to meaningful service improvements and to figure out how to keep doing that over time. So here, service design showed up as something of a learn by doing program, a collaborative process to build understanding and capability in an org that honestly some folks would consider low design maturity. Though I really hate that term. I think many orgs don't actually need to mature their design practice as much as they just need better opportunities to learn and experiment safely together. Either way, in this case, we did qualitative research together, helped enrich their view of the member experience, and mapped the ecosystem of all the policies, decisions, and service touchpoints shaping those experiences. And then we translated those insights into internal stories that can inform decision making and investment. And we didn't do it for them, we did it with them together, learning as a verb, not a noun. And the tangible outputs here are familiar artifacts to any of you, I'm sure, maps, templates, you guys know the drill. But the real impact here was in the team's evolving practice. They gained better visibility into the service ecosystem that they were operating within and strengthened their muscle for integrating member insights into their work in ways they just hadn't been doing previously. Plus, they built some stronger reflection and communication skills along the way, too. In essence, the organization here wasn't just gathering insights, it was learning how to learn continuously and to use that adaptive capacity to shape services in a changing landscape. And Lord knows the landscape in this case, healthcare regulatory, is going to keep changing. Finally, let's zoom all the way out to the enterprise level, a national healthcare organization under significant pressure to improve performance, quality ratings, and health outcomes. And like many organizations at this scale, they weren't suffering from a lack of effort, but really more from a lack of coherence. This is truly a study in complexity, not just across their market, but also the broader health ecosystem and even inside their own organizational structures. Teams were tackling pieces of the problem in isolation. Priorities were at times unclear or often conflicting. They were always plural. And these initiatives overlapped with each other or collided or simply just suffocated in silos before they could really create any meaningful change. So this is where service design looks more like organizational infrastructure. Over the course of 6 months, we convened and facilitated a series of working sessions that brought stakeholders from across the enterprise into the same room. Again, and I stress together, We mapped interdependencies. We surfaced those hidden constraints and unintended consequences, and we explored where energy and possibility already exist in the present. These sessions explicitly linked far-flung team members and their day-to-day decisions to a more central strategic intent. And like the other examples, the result here is not a sweeping overhaul of the service ecosystem or a transformational master plan. Really is just a more coherent sense of direction and improved accountability across functions. And perhaps most importantly, it modeled and then established a form of collaboration that goes a little beyond these one-off workshops and evolves the organization's adaptive infrastructure, which can help it respond more effectively to change even when me or other service designers were not in the mix anymore. So it's a modest, but I think still significant step towards building that kind of cross-functional adaptive capacity that we're all interested in here. Now, design in these contexts wasn't just all about following the double diamond or delivering polished artifacts or managing perfectly orchestrated journeys. Those all might be part of it, but it wasn't about just those, nor was it about fine-tuning an engineered machine view of metrics and targets and performance. It really is much more about helping people see their own complex system more clearly and learn from the conditions they find themselves in, identify those next right moves so that they can gain some traction and start enabling more desirable things to emerge together. At the team level, that meant breaking through that inertia with very small available moves and low stakes experiments. While at the program level, it means building the skills and tools and habits that start to enable a team to sense and respond together as conditions change. And at the enterprise level, it meant creating the infrastructure for those diverse perspectives and priorities and initiatives to cohere as a self-adjusting whole. This is the fractal nature of adaptive capacity. It's a pattern of encountering and reframing and integrating that plays out at all these levels of a system. Different scales, different contexts, but the same implication here. Performance is not something you can engineer once and optimize forever. It's something you have to continually seed, scaffold, and adjust over time. And before you guys all ask me about the tools and the methods that were at play here, of course, we're drawing on a number of approaches that would be beyond the blueprint, but I'll give you a few. For example, I mentioned the Cynefin framework and the related estrogen mapping framework. We also used things like narrative data and shared sense making and lots of non-chronological, non-causal visualizations. For example, things like Wardley mapping or Zenko mapping, or working with ideas like warm data or liberating structures or any other number of dialogic approaches. So I can name all the tools or frameworks that might have worked well for us in some of these examples, but they're scaffolds, not scripts. And context is what determines their usefulness. So whether your own service design work is focused inward on organizational dynamics or outward on customer-facing experiences, your design choices have the power to create the built-in capacity for systems to adjust. And that's really key. Of course, now we all want to build adaptive capacity, right? Of course, great. So you just heard me say earlier that there's no such thing as a good universal best practice when we have a complex system. So how do we reconcile those? Well, instead of looking for universal best practices here, what we can do is think about guiding principles. And we saw a few of them in the examples here, and we can extract these principles and think about how we might apply them in context-sensitive ways. So, for example, think about momentum over milestones. Track what's moving, not just what's getting finished. Are small experiments building towards something larger? And think about sensing over predicting. Make sense of what's emerging now before, or at least at the same time as you're planning what's next. Think about conditions over control. Focus on enabling affordances, things that make desirable possibilities easier to emerge, as much as, if not more, than just trying to engineer specific outcomes. And think about participation over prescription. Create more ways for more people to see, decide, and act together. Adaptive capacity is a team sport because no one perspective reveals all angles. And now I know some of you are also probably thinking, this is all well and good, Jen. I love it, but I still have KPIs to track. I still have quarterly targets I have to hit. I have a roadmap I have to follow. And all of that is fine. None of this is about telling you to throw those things away. It's simply about adding new signals to your dashboard, metaphorically or literally. Signals that tell you whether something is good in terms of adaptation or not, whether it's helping an organization become more adaptive and better able to learn, or whether it's preventing it from doing that. So, if I'm going to stand here and argue that learning is an important performance signal, which I am, then I know we have to measure it, right? So, we don't do that by counting the number of Acme catapults launched or the number of trainings people attend. We do that by tracking signals that show us if learning is happening. This is not an authoritative list, and it's going to look really different for every industry or company or team. But if you're curious how you might do that, here's some ways you could think about it. You could think about narrative signals, okay? So are the stories that people tell about their work changing over time? Do these stories reflect experimentation or adaptation or, I'm wondering and I'm going to try to learn about this? Do you even know what kind of stories people might tell about their work? So that's a place to start. What about velocity signals? So, how quickly do new ideas or insights become shared understanding and then shared practice? What about integration signals? Are new methods, tools, or perspectives sticking? Are they spreading? Are they shaping how decisions get made? And how about participation signals? Is the circle of people that are engaged in learning or experimentation growing wider over time? Are diverse perspectives being included earlier and more often? How about inquiry or question type signals? Okay, are we seeing a shift in the types of questions people are asking from things like, how do we fix this, to what's changing and how do we respond? So these are not soft metrics. These are leading indicators of innovation and strategic agility. These are the very things that are going to determine whether your organization thrives in the complexity of the years to come. So if you forget literally everything I've just said, just remember this, okay? Next time you feel like our buddy here, my advice to you is to practice learning. One of the most powerful and underrated things you can do as a service designer in a complex environment, trying to build adaptive capacity for yourself, your team, or the services you design, is to practice learning and make learning a practice. Run more experiments. And I'm not talking big formal pilots with executive sponsorship and allotted budgets. I mean low cost, low risk probes that help you learn faster. Try something with intention and curiosity and talk about what you learned from it. So, could you prototype an intriguing idea with a tiny group of people? Could you invite a few stakeholders into a process where they typically aren't present and see how it shifts the conversation? Maybe you could tweak an internal communication flow for just a couple weeks and measure the difference. Could you remove a stage gate or a permission layer or an approval process in the next planning cycle? Maybe you could entrust someone with something low stakes that you haven't previously, or even hand the lead to someone else entirely. These kinds of experiments don't just surface better answers, they normalize learning as part of the work, rather than as something you just do once in a while as a discrete chunk, like user research sessions or retros or reviews. And even if you personally have no authority, no permission, and no influence over anyone else's schedules or decisions, you still have a field to work in yourself. So, how can you create a little elbow room in your own space and practice for this kind of learning? You might well find others sidle up next to you to join in. So, finally, I want to leave you with this thought. It's a question I hope you'll take back to your teams. What would change if learning itself wasn't just a key performance indicator, but your North Star metric? What would change about how you measure progress, how you design services? How would this impact the people you serve? What signals would you expect to see? That's it. Thanks, folks.